Thank you all for being here. Happy Black History Month. And Rick, it's great to be with you virtually. Wish I could be there in person, but I'm in Chicago.
Glad you're here, Jerry.
Yeah. So Rick, we have to have a personal question before we get into the book. I met you when you were rolling off the Dallas County Historical Commission, and that commission just does so much great work. I want you to talk just a little bit about what the Dallas County Historical Commission does, and I think it's connected to what we're going to talk about today. Can you talk about that? You've done so much great work with that, and I actually took over editing the Chronicle for you too. So,
well, every county in the state of Texas is required to have a historical commission. They serve as the first level of review for all state historical marker applications. So it's a very, very important organization. Very, very rarely will the state proceed with a marker application if the local historical commission does not concur. What's been really nice, and this is really dovetails nicely with what we're going to talk about, and certainly dovetails with what Jerry's done over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, is our historical commission really made an effort to recognize what they regarded as underreported or underappreciated facts from Dallas County history. Now, some of those are very positive, like the first woman juror who ever served on a jury in Dallas County. Some on the other side address some of the more darker, uglier sides of Dallas County history, like lynchings. But nonetheless, while there are things we're proud of and things we're not so proud of, they are parts of our history. And that's how we learn about the present. And that's how we hopefully will begin to anticipate what we're going to do in the future, is by learning the past. So those are some of the things that the Historical Commission did when I was staff and when I first met Jerry.
Well, thank you for that. I also want to follow that up by just talking about what led you to write this book, particularly about what you term as riots, what some scholars that I also follow term as uprisings. In 1967, what was happening in this country?
Well, first of all, we all love graphics or visual items. This is the copy of the book that Jerry made reference to, and it's called Two Societies, the Rioting of 1967 and the Writing of the Kerner Report. In 1967, there was a massive wave of rioting that spread throughout the United States. It went from Boston to Tampa to Tucson, even to Middle America, Des Moines and Omaha. It didn't seem to matter whether you were a large city, a small city, a northern city, a southern city, had a large black population or a small black population. There was rioting. And as you might imagine, as the spring and the summer went on, the frequency and the intensity of these disturbances increased. And again, as you might have imagined, all of America, but especially white America, was really troubled and concerned about what was going on. They were incredibly fearful. And there was almost panic and hysteria spreading throughout the country. We have to go back to 1967 and realize how segregated we were as a people then. I grew up in traditional white middle-class suburban type neighborhoods, either in Oklahoma City or in Dallas. And my world was such that the only people of color we encountered, or my family encountered as of color, were custodians, were the people who did landscaping work, maybe some construction, were domestics. The black middle class existed to serve other blacks. There was really no mixing socially or economically between whites and blacks. So as a result of that, of any population group, if you don't have a lot of frequency and commonality or contact, it's the fear of the unknown. So when people are turning on their TV every evening and watching the nightly news, which was what we all did then because there were only 3 channels and we all watched the same things, we were seeing this rioting spreading throughout the United States. And it was always in black neighborhoods, and the riots always involved African Americans. So whites, as you might imagine, the rumors spread dramatically, where every city worried they were next. There were rumors in a lot of the cities that there were carloads of blacks heading to the white suburbs. Gun sales in a lot of communities skyrocketed. So that's the background. Responding to this crisis, President Lyndon Johnson appointed a special 11-member committee to investigate what was going on. And the governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner, was selected to be the chairman of this commission, and that's why we always call it the Kerner Report or the Kerner Commission. And 7 months after the commission was appointed, they delivered their findings. And the findings, depending on your perspective, either shocked you, dismayed you, made you angry, or surprised you. Public opinion polling had shown that 3/4 of white America believed that the rioting was caused by a conspiracy, by communists, by radicals, by hoodlums, criminals, riffraff. This report, and this is the report that most people bought, said something else much, much different. It said that the rioting was a reaction to decades of pervasive discrimination and segregation, and that the riots were not caused by hoodlums or riffraff. They did a special study of 14,000 people who'd been arrested and looked at their backgrounds and their records. And they found that the people who were arrested were not drifters or losers. They were lifelong residents of the city in which they rioted in. They actually had a job. They'd actually stayed in school longer than the average person in their neighborhood. And they didn't have a criminal record that was any different than the average person in their neighborhood. In other words, they were playing the game. They were doing what you're supposed to do to get ahead. Yet they were willing to risk it all by participating in a riot. We also have to realize who was the FBI director at that time. It was J. Edgar Hoover, who was no fan of the civil rights movement and who liked to blame communists for everything, including whether it rained that morning or whether traffic was bad. And if he couldn't find any evidence that there was a conspiracy or that communists or radicals or militants were behind it, then you have to reasonably conclude there was no such thing. Because that's what the report concluded, was that it wasn't losers or communists, that it was reaction to discrimination caused by whites. Again, people were shocked, dismayed, surprised, or angered. They also gave a prophetic warning, which they said in the introduction, that despite the advances that had been going on in the last decade, they were concerned that America was moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And that's the line that everybody remembers the report from. And that line is in the summary. And for many people, that summary is the entire report, not the other 582 pages that follow, but that summary. And Jerry, you asked me, how did I get involved? You asked me that about 10 minutes ago, I think.
I did, and I want to preface that with this next question.
Thank you for not pointing that out.
Hold on.
In that summer in 1967.
Can you hear me, Rick?
I'm sorry. Yes, I can.
I want to preface that with in adding this part of the question, since you already addressed it. As a young person growing up in Chicago, particularly on the south side of Chicago, I'm not sure people are familiar with this, but the south sides and the west sides of Chicago were considered the most contiguous, racially segregated parts of the United States that had the largest black population outside of Africa. I heard this from a great statistician, and I thought it was a really important thing to notice, because we saw riots and uprisings very differently. As a child, I learned about the 1919 uprisings in Chicago. It was a race riot by white gangs from Bridgeport. And I also learned about the murder of Fred Hampton by COINTELPRO, the FBI, and the Chicago police. And so we had thought about these things very differently. I'm also interested, you brought up the two societies part. My question is also, W.B. Du Bois, early 19th century, 20th century sociologist, talked about the color line and how, people in Black America have this double consciousness. Do you think we're still moving towards those two societies? And I think you're going to address that a little bit when you talk about the writing of the Kerner Report. But what do you think about that?
Well, there are still two societies in terms of black and white in this country. Despite the progress that we had made in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and I will say despite the progress that we've made since then, we still have elements and remnants of two societies. And we can go down the various examples of that. The fact that no matter how low the national unemployment rate is, Black unemployment is always still twice that of what white unemployment is. All we have to do is point out the Breonna Taylors and the George Fergusons to know that there's a really strong difference between how law enforcement handles some situations and how they handle others. So while I think overall we've been making progress, and we can use the half full, half empty analogy of a glass of water, I think we have more water in the glass than we did in 1968, but we still have, I think, more water to add to that glass, and frankly, probably more water than any of us anticipated, whether it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, or even when I was in college in the 70s and the 80s.
I totally agree, Rick. You also, you posed some questions to me as well. You talked about how did the commission actually reach its conclusions? Can you talk about who was on the commission and who they interviewed and what they actually did during the commission findings?
That is really, I think, one of the greatest strong points of the commission, or one of the lessons that we can learn from it, is that they were able to unanimously adopt a boldly worded, starkly concluded report on a topic as difficult as race. Right now in America, we can't agree on anything, no matter how simple or minor it seems to be, whether it's teacher salaries to you fill in the blank. We can't ever seem to agree on anything. So the fact that these 11 individuals were able to unanimously agree, we need to figure out how they did it and try to learn from that. When you look at what their backgrounds are, you're even more amazed at how they did it. They had people, out of the 11 members, one was a Southern police chief at a time when that was not the most racially enlightened occupation in America. You had the owner of a radio station in Kentucky, of all places. You had a small town Republican congressman from Ohio whose district was only 2% black. You had a senator from Oklahoma. You had a self-made millionaire from West Texas who strongly believed in the bootstrap mentality. Yet somehow those 5, 6 individuals with the other 5 or 6 folks that were on the commission with them were able to work through this. And the way they did that is things that we can copy and we can emulate today, whether it's here at the county, whether it's with our neighbors, whether it's with our own family members. And it starts with something as simple as being respectful and courteous towards one another. When they had differences, they didn't immediately lapse into name calling like you see today, where, oh, you're a racist. Well, no, you're a socialist. They didn't do any of that. They tried to focus on what they had in common and then work from there. And when they did that, they often realized that it was a difference over wording. It was a difference over tone or emphasis. And they were able to begin to formulate suggestions for how to resolve those differences. Again, those are things that we can do every day in our own lives. And I think that's something that our leaders, whether they're local, state, or federal, sometimes ignore or choose not to understand. Oh, and you also asked, Jerry, how did they reach these conclusions? That's a very important thing. They didn't just recycle literature that had already been done before or somebody else's research. I made a mention of the study they did of 14,000 arrestees. That was groundbreaking research. They sent field teams to 23 cities that spent a week in every one of those cities. Those field members didn't just go and then talk to the mayor and the police chief. They actually would walk through the neighborhoods unannounced and talk to people who were there. They did public opinion polling of people who lived in these neighborhoods to find out what their views were on what it was like to live in their city, how responsive they thought their city was, what issues or grievances they had, their thoughts about the federal government and how well services were or were not delivered. They also had the commissioners themselves went to 10 of the cities and did much the same thing, where they would walk unannounced through neighborhoods and visit with people who were in the barber shops or standing on the street corner waiting for a bus. And oftentimes the commissioners themselves would remark on, I didn't know it was this bad. Now, Otto Kerner was the governor of Illinois, and he was, as he said, a city boy. He grew up in Chicago. But until he actually went out and started seeing the conditions, he said he was shocked. He didn't realize it was as bad as it was. And there is no substitute. You can look at pictures, you can look at numbers, but until you're actually there on the ground and you see what's there, and you talk to the people and you can see in their faces and you can hear what they say and understand the inflection in their voice, you have a much better understanding. And when they would take that evidence and then go back to the local city hall and say, well, tell me what you see about this, oftentimes they were confronted with explanations of, oh, we don't have a problem. You know, things are just fine. We don't know what you're talking about. Even though the park in one neighborhood might be just an empty lot with high weeds and broken glass, and another neighborhood had a swimming pool, they didn't see that there was any problem. So to be there was very, very critical. And I think that is some of what we experience today with the disconnection that we have of various segments of our population, regardless of what the issue is. We don't put ourselves there. We don't personally experience it. We rely too heavily on what we see on our telephones or what we see on our televisions. We don't really bother to go and see or talk to somebody who's from there. I know I didn't really understand that for the longest time until I started to travel more extensively as an adult in this country and then abroad. There are just things that you don't really realize or understand because we're all in our own little bubble some way. Some bubbles are bigger than others, but until you really get out and see certain things, and it can be all you're doing is going from one suburb to another suburb, even in this metropolitan area, you may see things that you just didn't really understand or appreciate.
Thank you, Rick. One of those people that they actually interviewed was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He called the report a physician's warning of approaching death with a prescription for life. This is very interesting because he would also be assassinated a year later after the 1967 riots. And there would be riots about his death as well, right? I'm interested in your thoughts around why President Lyndon B. Johnson decided not to go with the recommendations that came out of the report. And can you share a little bit about those recommendations?
There are a number of theories as to why Johnson did not embrace the report. To say that he was cold towards it is an understatement, actually. He didn't even bother to send out the perfunctory thank you for your service letters that everybody always sends out whenever you serve on a commission. He did not have any elaborate Rose Garden ceremony where he officially received the report. It is thought that he had that attitude for a number of reasons. One of which is that the self-made millionaire that I referenced earlier was a friend of his. And it's thought that this commission member, his name is Charles Thornton, and his nickname was Tex, appropriately enough, was giving backdoor information to Johnson about the report as it was being drafted. Now, Thornton was clearly in favor of civil rights, but because he was a self-made millionaire, he did not believe in government programs at all. And if you go back to the beginning of 1968, Lyndon Johnson was faced with an enormous dilemma of how to finance both a domestic war on poverty and a war on Vietnam. And the last thing he needed was another report to say, we need you to spend, and it was rumored, another $30 billion, which is roughly what it was costing to fight the war in Vietnam. He had already asked Congress to impose a temporary increase in income taxes. As you might imagine, that wasn't very well received, so he didn't need another addition to his financial equation to make his life even more comfortable. Let's also go back to the beginning of 1968. That was a bad year for Lyndon Johnson. The first week of January, the USS Pueblo, a spy ship, an American spy ship, was captured by North Korea, and the people on board there were imprisoned and tortured. All right, so that's how the new year starts for LBJ. Then 3 weeks after that, we have the Tet Offensive in South Vietnam. And that had occurred only about 2 months after General Westmoreland had addressed Congress and said, there's light at the end of the tunnel, things are going well in Vietnam. Well, 2 months later, we suddenly have the Viet Cong inside the walls of the American embassy in Saigon. So things aren't going well. Westmoreland says, don't worry, we put down that rebellion. Things are going so well. We won. things are going so well, I only need another 200,000 troops. And it's like, well, thank goodness you put down that rebellion and things are going well, because you're only asking for another 40% increase in troops. I'm glad we didn't lose. Then comes the New Hampshire primary, where Johnson loses all the delegates to Gene McCarthy, who nobody thought was going to get anything. You fast forward another couple of weeks, probably his bitterest foe, Robert Kennedy, decides to run for president. So this is the first 90 days for Lyndon Johnson in 1968. And about that time, this report comes out. So he's already having a bad year, and this didn't help things any better. So you can see why he wasn't enamored with it. It's also thought that because of Lyndon Johnson, as large of an ego as he had, almost as large as the state of Texas, he was incredibly sensitive about things. And because I think at Thornton, he only saw the report for pointing out what hadn't been done. He felt like he maybe wasn't given enough credit for the things that had been done during his administration. Now, the Kerner Commission staff heard that rumor, and they went back and looked, and they compiled something like a 6-page, single-spaced list of all the times they had pointed out in the report things that had been done during the Johnson administration. But it didn't matter. To Lyndon Johnson, it wasn't enough. They only pointed out what he didn't do. That's how he interpreted the report. So he never officially received or welcomed the report as well as one would have thought or one would have hoped.
Thank you. You also, in your book, you talked about the writing of the report. Can you tell us who was left out of the report and what the report was missing, to your humble opinion?
The report really only talks about Black America. And the reason is because that was the charge it was given. The commission was created to look into why there was rioting in Black neighborhoods. It was not created to look at poverty in Appalachia. It was not created to look at what the situation, the role of women. It was not created to study to what extent Hispanics were being assimilated in America. Its sole focus was to look at what was going on in the Black neighborhoods that had rioted. Now, as far as what was left out of the actual report that I wish they had done, it does a tremendous job of documenting the disparity between white and Black America. There's like 100 pages of statistics and tables in here about unemployment and education levels and differences in housing and healthcare and all those kinds of things. It also talks about how discrimination was the reason why these conditions and this disparity existed. What I wish they would have done was to actually give real-world daily examples of how discrimination is perpetuated and how it continues and exists. And we all know, either from personal experiences or what people have told us, of what it's like to be discriminated against when you're a person of color, ranging from being followed in a shopping mall unless you're really dressed like you're going to church, having the clerk engage in small talk with the white customer, but not necessarily with you. And just, we can go on and on about that. But those kinds of things weren't in here. Instead, it blames society as a whole, which is good. But it's often been said, when you blamed all of society, everyone's responsible, but no one's responsible. It gives you the opportunity to go, well, it's not me, it's my next door neighbor. I know he's a racist, or he says things that are rude, but I don't do that. And I wish the report, and I've talked to the staff, and a lot of them wish they had, in retrospect, singled out or given real world examples of that.
Thank you for that. I'm interested in what you think the report tells us about Texas and Dallas County, particularly because I think, the events around 1963, JFK's assassination, where 2 hours later, LBJ becomes president at Love Field here in Dallas. And, fast forward to 1968, this report is on his lap, right? But there are so many things that happened in between him becoming president, including the civil rights legislation, voters' rights legislation, the war on poverty that gave us Head Start, and so many other things. Can you tell us about how this is connected to the story of Dallas and Texas as a whole?
Well, one thing that is discussed in the Kerner report is that the levels of disparity that they found between Black America and white America existed nationally. It wasn't just in the South, it wasn't just in the Northeast, it was everywhere. And you can look at the statistics in Dallas or the Dallas area, and the same thing was that as well. Median income was a lot lower for African Americans in Dallas versus whites. Educational levels were grossly different. Life expectancy was grossly different. One of the things that, let's see if I can find this statistic. Here we go. In 1970, there were 18 members of the Dallas County, there were 18 members in the state legislature that were from Dallas County, representing bits and pieces of Dallas County. Out of that 18, one was of color. There were 11 city council members. Even though the city was about 20%, 25% Black, only one of them were of color. And so that's the pattern that was repeated throughout the United States. So let's now fast forward 50-something years, and we could talk about how things have changed now. We have in the city of Dallas, out of the 15 council people, 4 are African American. We could talk about that out of the 18 members of the Dallas County delegation in the legislature now, 6 are African American. We have a Black mayor, and he's not the first Black mayor we've had. So we can clearly see that. We can see how there has been the integration and desegregation of our suburbs. I grew up in Richardson, and in 1970, there were something like 48,000 people living in Richardson. According to the 1970 census, there were 24 African Americans living in the city of Richardson. Now today, in the city of Richardson, there's a population of almost 12% that's African American. And that's not out of the ordinary. You've got communities like Irving with 14%, Garland 19%, Duncanville's 32%. So what was formerly regarded as these white enclaves, these impenetrable white enclaves, are now racially mixed. And the important thing to recognize that is that location influences so much about what kind of life you're going to have, what kind of housing you live in, what kind of job opportunities you're going to have, what kind of employment opportunities, what kind of educational opportunities. So the fact that we've been able to have a Black population escape the traditional enclosed neighborhoods with few opportunities, I think has really, really helped a lot. It's also not to say that because we did not have rioting in the 1960s like Detroit and Newark and Chicago, and we can go on down the list, that everything was hunky-dory in Dallas. A lot of people don't know this, that in the early 1950s, there were houses, Black houses, that were being purchased on the edge of white neighborhoods by Blacks that were blown up. So we had our own series of racial violence. Yes, we desegregated our restaurants and our movie theaters, and it was a lot more peacefully than it happened in other southern cities. But again, they didn't voluntarily do that. There were things that were going on while we didn't have the overt racism that you had in Birmingham, let's say. It was much more subtle. And those of you who were here then or had relatives, you know how real it was. And it's nice that it wasn't overt and terribly violent, but it was still there, and it did inhibit our ability to go forward, I think.
Thank you for that, Rick. I would push back and say I've talked to a lot of Black Dallas elders, and they say it was incredibly overt. I just recently wrote an article about Lincoln High School and their 10-year struggle to get that high school built because folks were threatening to shoot students and parents as they entered the school because they have had the newest DISD high school in the 1930s. So it was some really interesting stories in our history. I'm interested in our current day. If you would have asked me 10 years ago, are we making progress in Dallas, I would have, looked at you with a side eye. But with the work that we've done at Dallas TRHT and the work at the city and the county level, and even our school districts. Rick, I helped create equity policy for Richardson ISD. I'm interested in where we are now. I do want to give folks an update. Dallas probably is the most equitable infrastructure for us to have a thriving community for everyone in the South, period. We now have the Office of Equity and Inclusion at the Dallas County office. Dallas County has also declared racism a public health crisis. The city of Dallas has an equity office and a human rights office. We also have a racial equity plan at the city with $40 million attached to it. The Dallas Independent School District also has a racial equity office. We have that. No other city in Texas and probably in the South has that infrastructure. So I know that we've improved on things and definitely have the infrastructure. But where do you see us now, and where do you see us going when it comes to the things that were reported in the Kerner report?
Well, it's not just Dallas. I think you can't separate us out any more than you can, I think, any other part of the country. Maybe we're a little bit more on firmer ground, or we have a more clear direction, as you indicated, than some others. But I think it's safe to say we're in the most contentious period that we've been in since the 1960s. I worry about, here's a great way of explaining this. In 2017, I was doing an article for a symposium that was going to celebrate or commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Kerner report. So I talked to a lot of the staff that was still alive, and I asked them the question. I said, are we still making progress? Because we had just sort of had the Ferguson situation. And Trump had just been elected the first time. And they all generally said, yeah, it's a little troubling what's going on, but we're still headed in the right direction. And as one said, there's no going back. Then 6 years later, as I'm finishing up the book, I touch base with those folks again. And the attitude was a lot different. And the one that I mentioned said, we're not going back. He was the first one that said, yeah. We're going backwards. And what I think we all need to be aware of is that there are certain things that we took for granted in this country, that we thought there were institutions and traditions and certain rules of protocol that, whether it was handed down by George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or FDR or whoever, that this is how it was always going to be. I think it is clear that we cannot rely on that we all need to be involved any which way we can. And I think the first way is by setting a good example. As Daryl Martin and I have talked about, individuals matter. How we interact with people that we know, I think will go a long way towards that. But yeah, these are troubling times. And Commissioner Daniel and I were talking about this before this discussion started. Commissioner Price is fond of saying rights are not given, they're demanded. And we have to demand that our current rights and privileges be maintained. If we're silent, then I think we all know what can happen.
Thank you, Rick. I want to make sure people also have time for questions. So if you have a question, get it ready. My last question, Rick, is why is this report important, almost 60 years after its unveiling? And why should folks read your incredibly researched book?
Well, I think that the report is important for a couple of reasons. It's regarded as one of the most significant accounts and descriptions of race in this country. And as I mentioned, there's 100 pages of documentation and even more pages of narrative that talk about why there are two societies. there's actually a chapter in here about historic discrimination in African American history. And as one African American historian told me, that kind of information you couldn't even get in a college textbook in most schools at that time, let alone finding it in a government document. And it was a government document that was immediately accessible to the general public, to an audience that normally wouldn't have gone looking for something about historic discrimination or African American history. There were 1 million copies of this book bought in the first 2 weeks that it was published. That exceeded even more copies than were bought during the first 2 weeks of the Warren Report, and then of the 9/11 report that came out obviously much, much later. America was so concerned that they rushed out to buy this report to see that was in it. So I think it's important for what is in it and what it represents. The other is it serves as a good benchmark then for helping us assess to what degree we've made progress, because it describes what it was like in 1967, 68. So we can then begin to compare either statistically or just with our own observations how much things have changed. And then the other thing that I think is important about this is what I mentioned a few minutes ago about how you can reach decisions. How you can facilitate consensus, how you can come to agreement. There are lessons here if you look behind that. And that's really what my book's about. Yeah, it talks about rioting and what was going on in 1967, but it's really about decision making. It's how they overcame obstacles. It's how they overcame differences in personalities and backgrounds. It's how they made decisions. And the way I wrote this is that every chapter is a standalone account of some aspect of the commission or the rioting. So if you don't want to read 10 chapters about rioting, you can read one. If you want to read a chapter about what the recommendations were, you can read one. You don't have to read the whole book. If you want to read how they handled a certain situation when an internal study came out and it turned out to be unacceptable, how they handled that, you can read that. So you don't have to read the whole thing. And then there's also the chapter, there's a couple of chapters I think most people always want to know about 1967, 68, is how much progress have we made? And then the other is, why did the rioting stop in 1968? And there's a chapter in here that talks about to what degree we've had progress and what the report's legacy is and how much of the report was implemented. Because a lot of people believe that the report was a lost opportunity and was not implemented. But I've gone back and been able to, I believe, document that far more of the report was implemented than most people think. And then it also gives some explanations for why the rioting seems to largely disappear after 1968. And as we all know, there had been isolated instances about once every decade after that, but nothing on the level of what we saw in 67, 68. And then it also looks into the George Floyd disorders in 2020. There were some people who wanted to make believe that it was 1967 all over again. But this book, there's a chapter on how those disturbances are vastly different than what happened in 67.
Thank you. Are there any questions in the room?
Rick, I have 3 questions. Number 1, were there any African Americans on the committee or people of color on the committee? Number 2, how long did it take for you to write this book and when did you get started? And number 3 is more of a statement. I'm surprised they went into neighborhoods that personally the members of the committee, that's surprising to me.
Well, 2 of the 11 members were African American. And if you think of what the composition of the American population was in 1967, that's about representative of what how many African Americans there were in the country. I think, though, it's important to realize that the report was written primarily by a bunch of white guys. There was only one person who was female. And I think it's important to say that because they knew who their audience was. Their audience was, and you can see this in their meeting minutes where they discuss this, you can see this in their correspondence. They know their audience is the white public. And if Johnson had appointed people to the commission, more people of color, or let's say people who are more strongly identified with civil rights, like let's say Walter Reuther, who was head of the United Auto Workers, and if he had appointed somebody who like John Lewis or James Farmer, then it would have been very easy for people who were opposed to what the report was seeking to say, well, what'd you expect? He stacked the deck. But because he had these people that I mentioned, small town congressman and a Southern police chief, it makes it harder for them to readily dismiss it. Now, they'll come up with some other creative excuse, but at least you didn't hand it to them. It is very interesting that they did go out in the field, and I think that's a credit to them. They felt the urgency, and they made it very clear from the very first meeting that they were going to be an on-hands commission. They weren't going to just sit back and wait for staff to give them reports or chapters to review. They wanted the report to be theirs, and to their credit, they did that. You asked me about how long it took me. I have about 5 different answers. I'll say 1967 when I was 11. I'll say 1977 when I was a college student, first found out there was a Kerner report and wondered what happened to it. I'll say sometime in the 80s or the 90s when I began my career, and I had the opportunity to serve on special committees or staff special committees and had a new appreciation for what the staff and the commission did. How did they write a 600-page report in 7 months? And you got to realize, they didn't have laptops then, they didn't have cell phones, they didn't have email, they had electric typewriters and bottles of whiteout. And they managed to do this report that is utilized groundbreaking research. It had never been done before that way. There had been riot reports studying one riot in Watts or Harlem or something like that, or St. Louis, but not 150 cities. So that was the other fascination. I started writing, I did my master's thesis on the Kerner report in 81. Was not happy with that. I felt there was still more that I needed to know and learn. I actively started writing, doing research for journal articles in 2014, and I did 5 of them. As far as actually sitting down and writing the report, it took me about 20 months. I started in October of, let's say, 21, 22, something like that. And generally had it done then March of 24, something like that. So.
What piqued your interest at 11?
Well, I grew up in a family where we watched the nightly news. My parents read both the morning paper and the evening paper. We took Life magazine. They never ever campaigned for anybody. And to my knowledge, they didn't really do a lot of donating or anything like that of money. But they took their responsibility of being an informed citizen very seriously. And they always voted for, not just governors and presidents, but when there was a city council meeting and the school board meeting. And so that's the kind of family I grew up in. And I would watch the evening news with them that summer of 67. And you're seeing these visuals of tanks running down American streets and National Guardsmen with bayonets crouching behind cars, and seeing all these fires. And it looked like some John Wayne movie. And I knew at the same time we were fighting a war on poverty, so why was this happening? So there was this disconnect. It's like, I want to know why, and of course I'm 11, and then I get distracted by the World Series and life goes on. But then when in college, when I found out there was this report, it was summary of the report was a chapter in a poli-sci textbook. And in the introduction to that chapter, it talked about there was this report. It was very controversial. And using the language of the 1970s, it said it was an elitist response to collective violence. And so I read the summary and I'm going, I don't think this is controversial. What the heck happened to it? So that's sort of how it kept going.
Any other questions here or online?
And thank you very much, first of all, for having this discussion going on today, because it's still very important. But one of the questions I had was, you kind of made a rough reference to other groups that benefited from the activities that Blacks went through in 77 and 78. And then you, particularly talking about the role of women in our country and what happened there. So it just seemed like it was a kickstart. Is that something that you would agree with?
Well, the 1960s was a time of so much change and so much the term I'm about to use has become so pejorative. There was a great awakening. There was the first time where, you saw the advent. It wasn't just the civil rights movement. There was the feminist movement, the gay rights movement. They all sort of had yes, they'd been going on for decades, but in the 1960s, it all sort of happened. And again, it was at the same time, the 60s in many respects seemed to be a time where we thought we could do anything, whether it was put a man on the moon or cure cancer, and we were going to solve all the world's problems in the 60s. So yeah, it's the Kerner report was not unlike, I think, a lot of other things that then happened at about the same time and then afterwards.
Rick, you talked about, I'll let you go. No, you go ahead.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts about how we as a community can address the polarization that is just out there and in your face? At the beginning of your discussion, you talked about the importance of treating people with dignity, treating people with kindness, things that were modeled for me when I grew up, but it's not what we see. And, I try to do my part, but how do we impact the society as a whole?
I use the expression "all politics is local," and I didn't create that term. When you think of, I don't care what city you live in, school board and city council election turnout is abysmal. If it makes 10%, it's a high turnout. So there is an enormous potential for us to influence things. And when you think about what's going on in so many school districts throughout the country now about how you teach African American history, or what you can even teach at all now, that is, I think, the first way and the most immediate way that we can begin to counteract that trend that exists now and begin to influence it going in another direction. Because if only 1 in 10 people at best is going to vote in those elections, it doesn't take many people to change who's on the school boards. Same thing with city councils. Same thing with, I think a lot of people don't pay attention to state legislature races. And when you think about that, it's the state legislature who determines the boundaries for who runs for Congress. That is really important. And I guarantee you probably 3/4 of America doesn't make that connection.
Rick, can I add to that?
Don't underestimate your ability to be a good role model. I'll use an example of a personal example for me. I've played on this hockey team for about 8 years, and there's a number of people on the team who are very conservative. And during the height of the pandemic and the furor over vaccinations, that sort of thing came up. And one day, I'm always one of the first people to show up before a game, and I'm in the locker room, and our goalie comes over, and he goes, "Rick, can I ask you a personal question?" And it's just he and I in the locker room. And I said, "Yeah, sure." And he said, I travel a lot for work. Work's encouraged me to get vaccinated, but, I don't, my wife doesn't want me to because, it's our constitutional privilege. And we talked about that. And we had that open discussion because of how, I like to think, how we've conducted our personal relationship on other things, not political. And because he felt like he could trust me and that I wasn't judgmental and that I could be amusing sometimes. And hopefully he thought I was a decent enough hockey player that we could have this conversation. And so I don't underestimate that ability to, because you look like because you are acting as being fair and objective and non-judgmental, you can have those kind of conversations about difficult issues. Daryl? Oh.
Jerry, were you going to say something as well?
Yeah, I, as a historian, I also take the approach that we have to look at democracy in Dallas very differently. 14-1 was decided in 1991, which means that representative democracy in Dallas is very new. So when we talk about when, you know, low turnout, which is historically low when it comes to our local elections, we also have to, uh, what we have to do is convince our electeds to be more vocal about, number one, getting people engaged. I think people just have to be out there a little bit more. I don't think we hear from our electeds enough about our local issues. Like, I think we need more town halls. We need democracy is about more people being engaged and talking. So I think we need more people engaged, particularly our electeds engaged in talking about people being engaged. We also need, and this is what I think Mayor Rawlings tried to do a little bit, but we need more of this. We need our um, municipalities to engage in healing events once something tragic happens. Uh, we don't have things that pull us back together once these things cause traumatic, um, very tragic things in our lives. For instance, like the Botham John shooting. Um, you know, they relied on community organizations who are underfunded to create vigils and bring the community together. It's just, if the city or someone else would have done something afterwards, instead of just name a street after him, would have done something to pull us all together and do some healing work, I think, you know, that would be helpful for us as a group, is more healing events from the city. In 2014, the city and the county did something called Conversations Around Race. It's the first time Mayor Rawlings in the city of Dallas apologized to Santos Rodriguez's parents. So we need more things like that, and they only happen, um, you know, every decade.
Okay, I think we have one last question.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Hey, my only question would be, well, I would first start off by saying cultural heritage is definitely something that we want to preserve. So with that being said, how would you suggest Gen Z being engaged in the understanding of where we were and how to keep moving forward while also understanding where we have been? Because I think a lot of the times we kind of forget about where we have come from, and therefore history repeats itself. So how do we engage the Generation Z in moving forward in the direction that we want to continue moving forward in, and the freedom and the way how we are able to actually live prior to how our ancestors have? You know, that's my main question. How would you engage that next generation coming up? What suggestions would you have for that?
Well, I think the thing is, you know, for any group to try to connect with another group, is you really sort of have to ask them, how would they like to receive the information? You know, what avenues what appeals to them? You know, we don't want it to be, you know, I had a conversation with a friend of mine a while ago about things that were happening. And we made some reference to something that happened, you know, when we were in high school. And he said, you got to understand, that's sort of like to our kids are all the same age. You know, that happened shortly after we invented fire, when we were fighting the dinosaurs. And so for us to say, oh, you know, let's sit down and talk, it's like, well, I think we need to ask them, how would they like, you have to know your audience, and you have to be able to talk their language in the format and the medium that they're used to. That would be what I would suggest first. And then I would do what the Kerner Commission did, is talk about what we have in common and ask them questions about what they think about the future and what do they think about the present. And have it be where we're as interested in their world as we want them to be interested in our world that happened 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Jerry, do you have any closing thoughts with that last question?
Of course. I serve on the board of an organization that serves teens to learn about history and organize here in Dallas. It's called Young Leaders Strong City. And what I know about those young folks is that Gen Z is actually keeping history alive in very interesting ways. They're actually the reasons why bookstores are still existing. The largest growing number of book readers are those Gen Zers. They also are turning those historical, you know, context elements into like digital elements. They're doing TikToks. They're doing something called Book Talk, where they turn a book they read into, you know, dramatic elements on social media. They're doing some really cool stuff. So I would say Gen Z is probably not the issue. I would say, you know, unfortunately, the boomers are some of the issues. Texas is now, you know, leading the country in banned books, and it is not Gen Zs who are doing that. So it's really important for us to check the older generation who actually saw some of these things and are being very reactive. Rick actually mentioned this in some of his commentary about how reactive people can be when they see stuff on TV but are not proximate to the issue. I think folks who are not proximate to the issue now are doing reactive things and taking us back. So our young people will help us.
Well, thank you so much, Rick and Jerry, for that wonderful conversation. And thanks everyone for coming. I'll just mention briefly, we'll be back, you know, next month is Women's History Month. So one of the events that we have planned, our Assistant County Administrator, Lynn Richardson, is going to be providing us a master class on theater and the impact on her life and our lives as well. So that'll be on March 19th, 12 to 1 in this same room. We'll have other things going on next month as well, but you know, y'all come back for sure. So yeah, thanks again. And yeah, once again, we have books, and I have a Sharpie here, so if you want autographs, thanks again.
Thank you all.